A luxury resort in paradise. Palm trees sway in the warm Bali night air. Guests sip cocktails beneath soft lantern light. It is the kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. But just outside the entrance, a taxi sits idling. Inside the trunk is a suitcase. And inside that suitcase is a body. What investigators discovered next would expose a shocking betrayal, a secret pregnancy, and a murder plot carried out by a daughter and her boyfriend. This heinous crime stunned the world, and the motive was rooted in betrayal, control, and greed. This is Murder Vault Chronicles. This is the story of Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer, the daughter and boyfriend behind one of the most shocking murders in paradise, what became known as the Bali Suitcase Murder. In August 2014, the St. Regis Resort in Nusa Dua, Bali, epitomized luxury, private villas, infinity pools, and five-star service catering to wealthy international travelers seeking tranquility and escape. For one Chicago socialite, the trip held deeper significance. Sheila von Wiese-Mack traveled to Bali with her 18-year-old daughter Heather, hoping that the vacation might mend their fractured relationship. Instead, it would become the setting of her murder. Sheila was a well-known figure in Chicago's elite circles. Educated, cultured, and financially secure, she had lived a life shaped by privilege and influence. After the death of her husband, music composer James Mack, she raised Heather in a large suburban home surrounded by wealth and opportunity. But behind closed doors, their relationship was anything but peaceful. Police had been called to their home dozens of times. Reports described screaming matches, physical confrontations, and escalating violence. At one point, Heather was accused of striking her mother. Another incident involved theft allegations and threats. Friends described a toxic cycle of control, rebellion, and resentment. By the summer of 2014, the relationship had reached a breaking point. Heather was pregnant, and her mother disapproved. Heather's boyfriend, Tommy Schaefer, was a Chicago high school acquaintance and aspiring rapper who performed under the name Tommy EXX. He had no steady job and little financial stability. Sheila reportedly viewed him as manipulative and dangerous. She did not want her daughter to be tied to him. Heather was convinced that her mother intended to force her to terminate the pregnancy. Whether that fear was real or perceived, it deepened the conflict. But there was another factor investigators would later uncover: money. Heather stood to inherit a trust fund valued at more than $1 million upon her mother's death. Prosecutors later argued that she promised to share the inheritance with Tommy. A motive had begun to form. Months before the trip, investigators say the couple discussed killing Sheila. Text messages and conversations suggested planning, timing, and method. Then Heather convinced her mother to take a trip to Bali. What Sheila did not know was that Tommy would secretly join them. Using her mother's credit card, Heather purchased his plane ticket. He arrived in Bali on August 11, 2014, joining Heather at the same luxury resort where she and her mother had arrived only days earlier. Sheila had spent less than a week in paradise, believing the journey might heal the growing distance between her and her daughter. Instead, within hours of Tommy Schaefer's arrival, any hope of reconciliation collapsed. By the next day, she would be dead. On August 12, 2014, the day of the murder, security cameras captured a heated argument between mother and daughter inside their hotel suite. The tension simmered for hours. Then Tommy Schaefer entered the room. Prosecutors say he attacked Sheila from behind, striking her repeatedly with a heavy object, later identified as a fruit bowl. As Sheila fought for her life, Heather helped restrain her. The assault was brutal and relentless. By the time it was over, Sheila von Wiese-Mack lay dead on the floor of the five-star hotel suite. However, the crime was not yet finished. The couple cleaned the room, wrapped the body, and stuffed it into a suitcase. They planned to dispose of the body and make their escape. In the early morning hours, they loaded a suitcase into a taxi and instructed the driver to wait while they retrieved more luggage. Instead, they vanished without a trace. As the taxi remained parked outside the resort, a dark fluid began to leak from the suitcase, pooling onto the pavement. Hotel staff noticed the situation and promptly called the authorities. Inside the suitcase, police found the body of Sheila von Wiese-Mack. The crime scene shocked Bali and quickly gained international attention. Meanwhile, Heather and Tommy checked into a nearby budget motel, trying to remain hidden. They were arrested the following day. Initially, Heather claimed that masked robbers had killed her mother. However, investigators quickly uncovered inconsistencies in her story. Security footage, forensic evidence, and witness statements dismantled her account. The truth emerged. A daughter had assisted in the murder of her own mother. Because of the brutal nature of the crime and the fact that the suspects were American citizens, the trial in Indonesia drew intense international media attention. Prosecutors argued the killing was premeditated and financially motivated. Heather's defense argued that she was a vulnerable teenager trapped in a toxic and controlling relationship. Her attorneys portrayed Tommy Schaefer as the dominant influence, claiming he manipulated her emotionally and psychologically and pressured her into participating in the murder. They described Heather as frightened, pregnant, and isolated in a foreign country, suggesting she feared both her boyfriend and her mother. Tommy Schaefer's defense told a very different story. His legal team argued that Heather was the architect of the plot. They claimed she lured her mother to Bali, paid for his travel, and promised him money from her inheritance. According to his defense, he was drawn into a plan she had already set in motion. Prosecutors rejected both diminished responsibility claims. They argued that the murder was intentional, planned, and driven by financial gain and personal control. Evidence presented in court included text messages, travel arrangements, and testimony indicating that the murder had been discussed before the trip. Indonesia does not employ jury trials. Instead, cases are decided by a panel of judges. The courtroom proceedings occurred under significant global scrutiny. Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer were tried together but provided separate testimonies, each trying to downplay their own involvement while shifting the blame onto the other. Observers noted moments of visible tension between the couple as details about the planning and the night of the murder were revealed. The violent nature of the crime and the fact that the accused were American citizens being tried in a foreign country turned the proceedings into an international media spectacle. Cameras filled the courthouse and headlines were splashed across news outlets in the United States, Europe, and Asia. The world looked on as the details of the murder in a luxury resort suite were unveiled. Prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the attack, highlighting how Sheila was struck multiple times and how efforts were made to conceal her body and escape the scene. They argued that the attempt to dispose of the suitcase demonstrated a clear consciousness of guilt. During the trial, Heather expressed remorse and at times appeared emotionally withdrawn. Tommy maintained that he did not intend for the situation to escalate into a fatal outcome. However, the judges found both Heather and Tommy responsible for the murder. In 2015, the panel of judges delivered its verdict. Tommy Schaefer was found guilty of premeditated murder for the fatal beating of Sheila von Wiese-Mack. Heather Mack was found guilty of assisting in the murder and being an accessory to the killing, with the court determining she helped plan the attack and conceal the body. Tommy was sentenced to 18 years in prison and was sent to Carabocan Prison in Bali, a notorious, overcrowded facility known internationally for housing foreign inmates. Heather received a 10-year prison sentence. The judges considered her age, pregnancy, and cooperation with authorities as mitigating factors. Initially, she was incarcerated at Bali's Carabocan Prison, but was later transferred to a women's prison in Bali, where she gave birth to her daughter while serving her sentence. Afterward, a relative in the United States later raised the child. Both avoided the death penalty, a sentence that was legally possible under Indonesian law. The verdict closed one chapter of the case, but the story was far from over. In 2021, Heather was released early for good behavior and subsequently deported to the United States. When her plane landed in Chicago, federal agents were waiting for her. She was arrested and charged with conspiracy to kill a U.S. national. Prosecutors argued that the murder plot had begun in the United States, giving federal courts jurisdiction over the case. In 2024, she was sentenced to 26 years in federal prison. Then, more than a decade after the murder, the case returned to headlines. In February 2026, Tommy Schaefer was released from an Indonesian prison after serving the majority of his sentence. He was immediately deported to the United States, where he is expected to face federal charges connected to the conspiracy. The story that began in a luxury resort in paradise continues to unfold. What started as a mother-daughter vacation ended in betrayal, greed, and violence. A suitcase left outside a five-star hotel revealed a shocking crime that exposed a dark reality. Sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from those closest to us. This has been Murder Vault Chronicles. Please like and subscribe to the channel.